Fiona, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, hello. I'm an occupational therapist, and I'm working in what is now called the Pathfinder team in West Sussex. And we're working across Sussex Partnership Trust and with community agencies as well to enable people to make a smooth transition from the trust, and also to capture those people who may be relapsing, and if possible to prevent that getting any worse and to bypass the delays of going through the normal channels. So it's a new approach in Sussex. It's actually been running a year and it's working well, and it's incorporating recovery into that service, really. So that's where I'm from.
That's brilliant. Welcome. Hopefully what we're finding out is going to be really of interest to you. Mel, would you like to say a few words?
So I'm from Hillingdon. Been out of practice with Zoom. I don't think I've attended a Zoom meeting for a few months now, so bear with me. I was involved in the research project for the last 2 years, focusing mostly on the IAGs, one-to-one time with the learners, but I'm also the pottery tutor. So it goes really well, the wellbeing side of things, and teaching pottery being a very therapeutic subject area. We've carried on with the provision this year. We've called it emotional health and wellbeing. So I'm looking after that curriculum again, carrying on with the IAGs, one-to-one sessions, meeting learners and building that relationship.
Fabulous, thank you. Janet, what brought you here today?
I'm a family learning coordinator in Northamptonshire, and we're just moving into looking at the ways that we can support families with mental health, and we're doing lots of exploring different things at the moment. So really I'm just joining in to see what I find out. That's it. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Kath, could I ask you if you want to say why you've come along?
Taking part in the discussion. I've just joined the other one with Sheffield as well. My situation is that I retired officially in the summer, thoroughly enjoying retirement, but from a point of view of my own mental health and well-being, I didn't want to cut off all the links with adult learning because I've spent so many years doing it. So I'm now enjoying participating in adult learning and all the content and policy and developments and everything, purely from a pleasurable point of view, without getting bogged down in all the things that used to wrap around the job, around budgets and finance and funding regulations and all that stuff that kind of weighs you down. I'm now thoroughly immersed in just enjoying adult learning as it should be. So just open to all the discussions, really.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Kath. And I'm going to go to Sue now. A few people in the chat not in a position to speak at the minute, but Sue Scott, if you would like to introduce yourself, that would be lovely.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sue. I'm from Berwick. We were one of the projects. We had one of the projects in the community learning mental health pilots. So I've been involved for the past 2 years. I was project manager. And I also did the information, advice and guidance sessions for all of the learners, and followed them up at each point. And we're also continuing our provision, which is great as well. We're embedding it within our community learning, so we don't have an overall project name for it, but we are still working with people that are experiencing mild to moderate mental health conditions, and it's going really well. We tried to keep up momentum, and yeah, that's paying off actually. Really busy courses, so that's great.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Keep the questions coming on the chat. I'm going to do a presentation now, which is not my usual style. I normally just show pictures. This is all words, but I'm going to try really hard not to be boring. So these are really early findings, and even Katina hasn't seen anything beyond the raw data at the minute. So I'm really interested to see what she thinks. There are some caveats. Oh, bear with me. The caveats are very early, very tentative findings. I'll say a little bit about what the methodology is so you can see the point at which we're at. you are very much hearing my personal standpoints. That is my position as a researcher. I don't try and write myself out of the process. I've been involved as part of the MHFE crowd and part of the support team to the projects for a couple of years on and off. So, you know, this is what I think, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm finding. And the other thing is that I cannot not know what I am learning from my other work with the CLMH project. So as part of the MHFE crowd, I'm also involved in curating the web pages of all the projects. I've got particular themes that I'm running through, which obviously dovetail, connect, in some places, you know, contradict the findings from the Educators Survey, and I'm not going to pretend to unknow that stuff. What I will do is just be really straight with you about where I'm finding the data. And then a bit about myself. I'm an independent freelancer, independent researcher in terms of where I'm positioned with this project. So this is the Community Learning Mental Health projects. Many of you will know these words better than I do, but just to say where we're coming from, the projects were funded through the £20 million Department for Education initiative that was announced in 2014. What the project was about was testing out with a short, part-time community learning courses, help people develop strategies to manage their mild to moderate mental health problems like stress, worry, anxiety and depression. Just noticed, if you just politely ignore that Twitter handle in the bottom corner, it hasn't saved all the way through. So from April 2015 to July 2017, there were 52 learning providers in England offering guidance and short community learning courses and refresh sessions to people. Many of you were involved in those projects. This is the Educators Survey. And what it is I think of them as figurations. What will come out of this huge project and many different strands of research, different methodologies. Some of you are aware of the Day in the Life Mass Observation Project. There's the curation of all the evidence. And then of course there is the, you know, the CLMH research findings themselves. And the Educators Survey it was our absolute determination to speak with tutors and learning support workers and guidance workers who were involved with the projects, but who weren't necessarily the people we were meeting on a regular basis as the project leads. So the survey took place in September 2017. 111 people took the time to respond, and the responses are phenomenal. The number of words, the depth of the reflection has really blown me away. Of those 111 people, 60% were involved in information, advice and guidance, 36% were involved in learner support, and 60% were involved in teaching. So obviously that adds up to more than 100. There were people taking on a number of different roles. Like you were saying, Mel, you were involved in the information, advice and guidance, also involved in teaching the pottery classes. The methodology of the educators' research, mixed methods. It was a very comprehensive SMART survey. I don't know if anyone here completed it. The idea was that we wanted to ethically, we're very mindful of ethics, ethically generate qualitative and quantitative data. The project leads were gatekeepers to disseminating the link to the SMART survey. So we did not have direct contact ourselves with many of the tutors. We did with some, but not, you know, but with many of them we didn't. So the project leads were our way into the tutors and the learning support workers and the guidance workers. That was problematic because obviously, you know, project funding had come to an end, people had moved on. So we're delighted with the depth of the data that we've got back. The analysis is taking place by a SMART survey. It has an internal analysis function and software called NVivo that's giving us the opportunity to really look at the words that people have written and look at drawing themes out of them, to do a textual analysis. That's the part that we haven't really started with yet. We're sort of in the middle of that process. So that's why the caveats around these being tentative findings. and we are disseminating the research findings from the educators research at on the 4th of December at an event at Manchester University, which will bring people together to look at the whole range of evidence. So I just want to, I picked out a couple of quotes. I could have picked out any number of like 1,000, but these were ones which really chimed with me. Someone who said, I feel proud. We asked people for the very first question, what did you feel most proud of? I feel proud of the space that was created for each group, a place where individuals felt safe and respected to share their thoughts and ideas and make mistakes. So we're talking about real safe spaces created by this project. And then someone else who said, having been able to manage as a tutor while having myself mental health issues and also being a learner just gives a hint of the complexity of roles that people played when they were part of this project. No wonder it was a 2 years that was incredibly meaningful and important to people in their careers and in their lives. The key messages from this first question that people really took time and trouble to answer I very much heard when I was reading through the responses that the respondents were proud of what they had done for others. That was an absolutely clear starting point. Very few people even writing themselves into the narrative of their response. It was all about the learners. Later, people got a little more critical. And while we went to a lot of trouble to try and make the survey itself not take up too much time, the depth of what we wanted to know meant that people were spending time on the survey, and I think that thinking was processing and percolating, and maybe as people felt safe going through the survey because it was completely anonymous, they were able to develop a more critical lens or express a more critical lens as they went through the questions. We asked quite a few questions. We were really interested in the training that participants had had. We knew as part of the national team that there'd been a huge amount of training done. There were significant training budgets given to each of the projects. The idea was that training would cascade out through the project leads nationally, the national training into the project centres, the research sites. 2/3 of respondents said that they had no dedicated training to prepare them for their involvement with CLMH. So there was a gap in the food chain there, clearly. And despite there being this really significant training budget, project leads undertook mandatory training as well. So there was no swerving it. But whether that message was getting out and getting to people on the front line, we seem to be saying, you know, we're not sure that always happened. What was the cause of that? Clearly, the limited cascading. There's going to be money in there somewhere. You know, in any research, we follow the money, don't we? Huge amounts of staff churn. But there's also a bit of a sense that training isn't seen as self-starting or even work. There was something one person said, which was, oh, well, I work full-time. You know, like, well, when am I going to do any training? Well, why is that not part of your work? You know, so what is that? And there was a question we asked about whether people had gone out and sourced training for themselves. 70% said no. So, you know, you might be feeling a bit insecure, but you're not doing anything about it yourself, almost awaiting for the organisation to provide. Again, reminding you that these are tentative findings and the textual analysis will tell us more, and it will be informed by the other research figurations, but that's been quite interesting. We asked questions about co-production, as this was a absolutely fundamental central principle of the whole research project. It was talked about masses at the national training. It's always been out there in the narrative around the projects. 48% of respondents were aware that training had been co-produced with people who have lived experience, either personally or as a carer. That was a principle of the national team. Every one of us on the national team, every one of the trainers who were brought in had lived experience. That means that more than 50% or just over 50% were not aware of the training being co-produced. Very few people said no, it wasn't co-produced. A lot of people, nearly 50% of people said, well, I don't know whether it was co-produced or not. It might have been, but nobody said. So that to me suggests that there's, you know, a lack of understanding despite the strong central messages about what this fundamental principle is. So that's something to pick up and follow through the other evidence. There's lots in there threaded through that still needs a lot of picking out about partnerships, and that chimes with me because if anybody attended the Association of Colleges webinar last week as part of the World Mental Health Day webinars, they would have heard Liz Maudsley from the AOC say, you know, their evidence of partnerships is that they can be helpful, but they're not always strong. In fact, what seems to be coming through is that partnerships are not always helpful, that competition for resources, competition for students is getting in the way of working. And in fact, there was sort of anti-helpful partnerships, if you like, competition in certain areas, and that's coming through in the research. So again, something to look more deeply into. In terms of professionalism, which for the purpose of this webinar, I'm defining as people who were really self-starting in terms of skilling themselves up for often a very new role. I've said that 70% of respondents didn't seek out any training for themselves, 30% did. But of those 30%, the ends that people went to were really, really impressive. So some examples: someone who'd not taught yoga for, I think it was 10 years, invested in themselves over £1,000 and 100 hours of yoga teaching practice in order to be able to teach yoga classes for the project that they were working on. People, apologies for the typo there, people were getting themselves genned up on co-production techniques. Others were accessing free websites and apps around mental health and well-being, an example being Mood Juice. Others were just talking to people in communities of practice. Some people accessed free online courses, such as Future Learn, which we were talking about in the last webinar as well. And others went to workshops. There were various examples of workshops, but you know, sometimes the presence of something alerts you to the fact that you're only seeing it once and not anywhere else. And the fact that somebody had been to a workshop on sexual diversity made a light bulb go on for me. I could not find, I haven't, you know, obviously there's more depth to go into, but I could not find another example of intersectionality with other protected characteristics. When people talked about, when equality was present in the data, it was present in terms of a mental health equality situation. People were not necessarily talking across other protected characteristics, which was interesting for me. We asked a question about training that had gone really well. What the header means is, what would ET do? The question was something like, you know, if ET sort of looked down, what would they see about, what did they see as the impact of the training that really worked for you? And it was so interesting to see, again, you know, tentatively, but people were talking not necessarily about, they weren't talking about knowledge necessarily, they were talking about the impact on their personal qualities such as patience and empathy. There's some wonderful work out there at the minute on empathy as a political act, really. Brené Brown, Raul Martinez, talking about how actually equality is practiced through empathy and through empathizing with people who live lives different to us. It's really interesting that that came out. People also talked in terms of skills, listening skills improved and digital skills improved. So that's what ET would see happening to an individual's practice as a consequence of being involved in the CLMH research project and in the training around that. We asked specific questions about mental health first aid. There's a lot in the air at the minute, which seems to be suggesting that a rollout of mental health first aid across all teacher training and all teaching, schools, you know, FE, universities would be really helpful. Interestingly, we had the impression, I think, that just about everybody had done mental health first aid. Well, maybe that was true of the project leads, but just under half of the respondents to this survey had completed mental health first aid training as part of the project. And I think, I need to check this, but I think we did ask if they'd done it in any other capacity as well. Of these, just under half, 54%, so just over a quarter in total, had attended the more comprehensive 2-day training. 41% had attended the half-day mental health awareness. When we asked, did this training prepare them for working with people with mild to moderate mental health problems, the most popular answer was yes, because it gave them confidence. So again, we're not talking about knowledge, we're not necessarily talking about skills, but we're talking about confidence to be able to engage with people in an effective manner. We asked educators what it was that they really needed to best work, to work really effectively in an education setting with people who have mild to moderate mental health problems. And they said very clearly, opportunities to listen and speak with others, opportunities to learn and grow empathy, good quality mental health first aid to grow that initial confidence, but then a real necessity for regular refreshers, training and coaching approaches to IAG. And I want to say here that the other figurations I've been involved in, looking at other evidence, all the other evidence, you know, the project pages and the evidence we have from projects, is that absolutely fundamental part of why projects felt that they had been successful was that CLMH allowed them to really integrate information, advice and guidance. Often people talked about coaching approaches to that, so that chimes across there. And then a real strong call for professional boundaries training. And where we had people working on the projects who were also clinicians, they often seemed to bring this with them and found it invaluable. In terms of organisations and organisational health, need to dig into it further, but there is some uncertainty around how organisations support workplace mental health and wellbeing. But nearly all respondents, 98% of respondents, thought that the workplace health where they worked had improved as a consequence of being involved with CLMH. That is quite something, isn't it? That's an astounding figure. In terms of employees themselves, however, 10% of people, of respondents, felt that there'd actually been a negative impact on their own personal mental health and well-being as a consequence of being involved in the project. Now, what the narrative told us throughout, and also through the other figurations, is that we're getting this sense that it's possible that staff well-being comes second to learner well-being in some organisations, and that's what's happening there. And I'll remind you that earlier on we'd identified staff churn as an issue. So there's a lot of insecurity, job insecurity, uncertainty, and massive workload issues. And I haven't said a lot about that here because I want to go on and you know, dig a bit deeper, but people were saying it was workload that had been the thing that impacted negatively on their own mental health and well-being. It certainly wasn't being around people with mild to moderate mental health problems, because working with the more open, in environments which were more open to discussing mental health and well-being, was seen very much as a positive thing and seen as the thing that had led to the organisational improvement in health and well-being. So here are the insights I've had across the various figurations, really focusing on what I'm seeing in the data here. I'm seeing that project leads have been very much gatekeepers to the people who participated in the survey, some of whom would also have been project leads. There is evidence of resistance to research methodology, so arguments that I'm going to describe as sort of grumpy just for the sake of it, but I'm not being pejorative there. Well-rehearsed arguments about, well, I didn't like this and I didn't like how it was being done. And it was, you know, about not being obedient to a research methodology that was different from a normal way of working. So that resistance appears across the whole board, and certainly here. A bit of a sense of fixed mindsets in some cases, fixed practice, fixed identity, and this issue around the lack of the training cascade and a siloism, particularly between, not in all cases, but in some cases, between education and health. Issues that were recurring around staff churn, fear, you know, of losing your job or losing hours, and 0 hours short-term cultures, which meant that people were saying things like, well, I know there'd been lots of training, you know, but that wasn't available when I came onto the project. And a sense that there is a reliance in the sector on exhaustible goodwill, and there's a lot of talk out there about that now. Staff, as even in the few months since we first put this survey together, staff wellbeing in education has become a big issue. People reported little time for thinking or reflection, and then massive evidence of othering defined as, you know, an inequality, defined as looking at people as being different and less than. And I am really seeing that everywhere in the evidence across all the research figurations. So a personal moment for me with this data was somebody who said, I have never worked with anybody with mental health issues before. What, really? Yeah? Because another piece of evidence that this data has given us is that 81% of respondents to this survey have had lived experience of mental ill health, either themselves or as carers, and yet there is still, you know, that sense of, and somebody saying, I've never worked with anybody with mental health issues before. So what's occurring? I think globally, what's occurring, Russell Brand said that just this morning on the to the BBC, we are living in a system that is not designed to suit the human spirit. And I don't just mean further education, adult education, community learning when I talk about that. We're living in a system. He's talking about the world. And so I'm bringing that in here because I think something really big is happening, and we are feeling it in FE, and we are exhausted in FE, in adult learning, by the goodwill that has kept everything going for so long. And the final word, really, I want to give over to a colleague, Peter Kelly, from the Health and Safety Executive. I don't know if anybody attended his really amazing World Mental Health Day webinar on Monday. I've watched the recording. Peter raised lots and lots of questions, but one of them is that goodwill preventing us, i.e. the workers, from calling out the stress that we're under? And there is some evidence of that in this survey.
I did a couple of reminders for you, which was to say that you did a focus group at St Helens before we developed the survey. So you met with some teachers there, and that was quite interesting, I seem to remember.
It really was. It really set the scene for us because they didn't say what I expected them to say, really. They absolutely led the way in talking about this confidence, personal skills thing, and in being completely open from the start about their own lived experience without giving detail, but just really saying, I was so glad of this opportunity to talk about mental health. It was brilliant.
Kath, you managed a project, you know, you were the overall most senior person in an organisation that was doing this project. Did you have any sense of the staff well-being in the process and how that relates to this, maybe?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. During the presentation, one of the things I was quite interested in was when you were talking about the culture of the project, how much was influenced by the culture of the participants being in an organisation that was, I can't remember your actual phrase that you used, but you talked about it being set in its ways, restricted, constrained. I would imagine most of the organisations that these projects were operating within were very structured and traditional and bound by regulation, and how much that influenced the ability of the staff that were involved in the project, the pilot projects, to do things differently. Did that come across at all in the research?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really something about reach, and where you were involved, Kath. I think we knew between us, certainly Katina, we knew everybody working on that project, whether they were paid or unpaid, whether they were learning champions. There's a hierarchy still in the organisation. We're not talking about a flat organisation, but you know, we knew people, and that seemed to really connect that. That gatekeeping role and how involved people felt. So where we have talked with tutors in other organisations, it's been quite shocking sometimes to realise how little they knew about the project, even that it was a research project. So where we found resistance, for example, and even subversion, if I'm honest, to the research methodology, it's been often because people have not been, you know, it's been subverted at a level higher than them, or they've just not understood what they're supposed to be doing because nobody's told them. Sometimes that's about churn, But I believe, and I can't yet justify this from the data, so bear with me, but I believe it's about how our sector, others, sessional workers, very part-time workers, tutors often, certainly learning support workers, certainly guidance workers and volunteers.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think there's also that distinction between short-term projects, and I think one of the difficulties was the fact that it was short-term. I know it was extended, but initially was only 12 months and went on. And how projects of that sort are almost seen as being outside of the organisation, or their, should I say, perhaps the status isn't quite as high as what may be described as the mainstream. And I think over years, projects like family learning, projects like basic literacy and numeracy have all had that experience of being the outside. And I wonder at what point mental health is going to, shall we say, take its seat at the table in the mainstream, because at the moment it does feel like it's the outside organisation in the way that perhaps literacy and numeracy was 20, 30 years ago. Family learning probably was 10, 20 years ago. There's that time, isn't there, before it's seen as being part of what we do rather than a project somewhere out there on the side.
I think that is beautifully expressed, Kath. It's about mindset, it's about structures, it's about reporting mechanisms. In the previous webinar, Sarah and Karen from Sheffield talked about how the mental health project had been mainstreamed to the point where it now took its place in the SAR, and in the structures we work under, that's the place for it to go, and not peripherally and at the sides. And I think I've long suspected that sense of, oh, it's projects, and I've experienced that in my own working life. But the fact that the funding was so generous for these projects, and yet there were still outsiders,
yeah.
I think says more about mindset than it does about the resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, entirely.
So Maya has said in the chat, that statement about never having worked with anyone with mental health issues is quite telling. It seems to be seen as something we don't talk about. Are we still ashamed to admit we are suffering? I don't know, Maya, if you read Brene Brown, but I get a sense of shame. I get a sense of shame in all of the evidence that I'm looking at. And more positively, I get a sense of stepping out of shame. So that statement about never having worked with anyone with mental health issues was in the minority by the end of that 2 years. At the start of the 2 years, if we'd done something similar, and of course I so wish we had, but you know, hindsight's a great thing, that would have been very much more prevalent, I am certain, and that's from my own experience of seeing people grow and move on. So yes, I still think we've got a long way to go, but I do think we have come a long way in that othering. That figure of 81% of respondents with lived experience, that's going to save us, I think.
Lou, just chipping in that we didn't do a survey back at the beginning, but Kath, did you come to that very first meeting? In April in Beers, because it was in 2015, and even if we didn't do it in writing, Lou, we did it in the conversations on the day. Okay. And can I just tell you, it was absolutely horrendous.
Okay.
I had two people come up to me at the end. One was a woman of colour who had been really upset by the day, and it was a really, really difficult reaction for many projects. Sue, Scott, were you there as well that day? Julie was there, actually, I remember. Really difficult day. And it was this sense of how dare you want us to talk about this issue. And how dare you came in two forms. It came from people who said, how dare you want us to talk about this, because why would anybody want to talk about mental health? But the other was, how dare you talk about this and put me at risk of being outed for having mental health problems. And both things were probably equally passionate on the day. The other thing to say was it was the place where there was almost a complete meltdown, although we'd put in the bids that people would have to use PHQ-9 and GAD-7 as tools for measuring people's mental health and the short WEMWIBs. We put that in the bids, and we made everybody write a statement in their responses to say they would use it, because I thought there would be problems. But I was very nearly publicly lynched at that session, and I was nearly publicly lynched mostly where we invited people to come along themselves, and they had to bring a partner from one of their local partnerships. So that could be the health service or a mental health charity if they were going to work with them. And it was the partners who were ready to almost lynch us for it, for moving into territory where they felt we didn't belong. And I think they created a culture of fear in many of the teachers who would have been open to it, and curriculum managers. And, you know, because if you've worked in adult education for a long time, you know you've worked with people with just about every diversity that's possible, and usually all the new communities in any society and any new group of people who have been damaged by some recent social policy. So you know that diversity is the lifeblood of community learning. But actually, the partners made everybody afraid to think about working around mental health. It was as though they were putting people at risk. And that, I think, made many of the people with lived experience hide for nearly most of the 2 years. So there's a lot of people I know about personally, but until we saw it in that survey, or that literally we would be in meetings and people would be too afraid, even amongst their peers they've worked with for 2 years, to share that lived experience. Sorry, that's a bit of a downer to kind of, you know, but so we did have, and there were lots of people who evidenced it, Lou, so we could say, you know, what that was like at the beginning. We could collect a couple of responses from people who were there.
You know, anecdotally, my sense was that we'd moved a long way, but to really read it and I think that's why that statement about never having worked with someone with mental health issues chimed so much, because actually, for the first time in that data, that's what struck the wrong note, and that's what's heartening, isn't it?
Mm. And I think it clearly takes time, doesn't it? I mean, I think, Sue, you said you had the same issue with tutors and their lack of confidence. You know, it came across as a lack of confidence, but you had Sue Bennett in to do some training for you in Blackburn, didn't you? That I think was a bit of a corner turner for you.
Yeah, and it really sort of rings true, the partnerships really of that. You're stepping on our territory here. And we had partners come in to deliver some mental health awareness training. And yeah, it was really. So we had Sue Bennett come over, and we worked closely with Chris over there, and tutors shared resources, and that was really positive. But tutors were quite nervous about it, really. But as I've always said, in adult learning, you open your door to anybody who walks in, and you don't know who's sat in front of you. So people, as you said, Katina, are dealing with everybody from every spectrum every single day. So here we were just saying, look, we are targeting people with mild to moderate mental health conditions. We were just putting it out there, and people just got so nervous, but we're actually dealing with it all the time. And when we got over that, we had some really great work achieved. I thought it was really interesting about the goodwill you were talking about, Lou, as well. And again, that I think that was the thing of people wanting to give it their all. One of our tutors, fractional tutor, this was her last thing. She's retired now, moved to Cornwall, and she said she wanted to go out on something that she would be really proud of, and she was really proud of it. And we all have been, but it has been, everybody's put in so much extra than you would in sort of any other work, really. And that's being recognised. That's really important, I think.
I think that's absolutely spot on here, but not so much here, possibly more in the interviews we've done with people where, some people have been really open. That sense of, and of course, all the way through the things people said to us about that absolute sense, that workplace stress, the exhaustion. People were doing this, and I'm not asking you for your experience because let's keep it anonymous, but people were doing this on top of the day job. And in cases where organisations have been paid well enough to properly employ somebody as well. Katina's not allowed to say that, but I am allowed to say it. I'm an independent researcher. You know, I don't see the money, but I know that people have been working under massive pressure and strain where it has not been financially necessary if you look at the project funding. And if that project funding, projects are separate when it suits, but, you know, is the money always separate when it suits as well? So that has been, you know, that workplace stress has absolutely been there. But despite that, what really, really shines through, and it's a great place to end, I think, is the pride. That first question, it was like opening up a clam. What are you most proud of? And the pride that comes through. I have loved working with this project. This has been the best thing I've ever done. You know, these are the sorts of things that most of the respondents have been saying. And that's just amazing. And, you know, it is all about that goodwill. And that's despite this, and this. It's still been the best thing I've ever done. I'm gonna, you know, it's not, I don't want to keep people longer than they've said they would stay. It's a work in progress, so I'm just putting that health warning in again. I will continue working on this and doing the textual analysis of the words that people have shared with us. And then on the 4th of December at Manchester University, I get to take the stage again and see how, you know, where we've really got to with it. So really looking forward to seeing some of you, if not there, then, you know, following that and seeing where we end up with this. But thank you for coming along.